Okay, here we go. Whither Europe and what next for Brexit? Moderator is my old friend, I underscore the word old, Ambassador Dan Freed.
Good afternoon. The last panel I was on was certainly exciting, and I have no way of predicting whether we will be visited again by a pro-Russian troll. Is it on? Okay. So we will see whether we are visited again by another pro-Russian troll, but really wasn't that fun. I'm joined by Nicola Tenzer, Robin Shepard, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, and my old friend Michał Baranovsky. And this is a discussion of Whither Europe, part of a set at the end of this conference, which I might call the State of the West. Whither Europe, whither the United States, and thank goodness I don't have to be on the panel discussing the United States under Trump. That will fall to the next people. But this is Whither Europe and what now for Brexit. I want to give the floor first to Robin Shepard, because Brexit is providing headlines and daily drama which eclipses the news coming out of Washington, and I didn't think that was possible. But here we are, and I think getting a handle on the best prognosis for Brexit, and then talking about how Europe proceeds from there would be a good way to go. And I have to say this by way of introduction to my Georgian friends. Georgia is counting on the West and believes in the West more than the West seems to believe in itself sometimes. But all is not lost. The West is going through, and this is my own views, not trying to predict what the panel will say. The West is going through one of its periodic low points. It is not the first, it will not be the last. The question is, how can we get out of it with as little damage as possible? Ultimately, I'm an optimist, but that depends on one's time perspective. This is an important issue for Georgia and for all of us. But I'll turn to Robin for the take on Brexit.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to everybody for staying around for the penultimate panel. Let's do two things when we're talking about Brexit. First of all, let's try and get out of the way of all the weeds. And when I got off the plane from Washington, D.C. yesterday, the day before, after a 10-hour flight, I had about 30 items on my Twitter feed, on my email list. And it was about, look, I've often said, wouldn't it be nice just to wake up when it's done, and then we'll see where we go. I think that you won't have to wait much longer. Brexit is going to happen. There are two reasons why I would say it's definitely going to happen by the end of this year. One is there is obviously a British political crisis going on. There's a parliamentary crisis. The government of Boris Johnson wants a general election. The opposition, led by Jeremy Corbyn, has been saying it wants a general election for years, and when it's offered one, now says it doesn't want a general election just yet. But at some point, all of the bluster will go away and we'll get an election. And what the opinion polls show is that Boris Johnson will almost certainly get a majority, and may, with a pact of some description, electoral pact with the Brexit Party, get a very large majority. One way or another, everybody is sick to death of this. When I live in the United States, I was over at my parents in the north of England during the summer. It was my mother's 80th birthday, and there were lots of friends of various generations. And my family, like many British families, was split. Some are Remain, some are pro-Brexit, some are very Remain, some are very Brexit. But the one thing I took away from that, and I don't come from a particularly political family, is that people are sick to death of the whole thing. And that's one of the things that Boris Johnson is offering, that even people who are on the Remain side now essentially, apart from a very hardcore who tend to turn up at conferences like this and live in a bubble in London, most people in Britain have had enough and just want to get this thing done. And I think that while it's been very difficult to make solid predictions over the last 2 or 3 years, right now I think it has come to a head, or it's coming to a head, and Brexit will happen almost certainly by the end of this year. We could get into a discussion where someone says, but yes, but what if this and that? I don't think we're going to have a very productive discussion if we do that. Let's assume Brexit is going to happen. What next? So I'll just say a couple of words on that and then be interesting to hear others' reaction. I suspect you're going to be very surprised by how little changes. And especially how little changes when it comes to the foreign policy of Britain, the foreign engagement of Britain in the world, the engagement of Britain in Europe, the engagement of Britain in Georgia. The United Kingdom is one of the very few countries in NATO that spends 2% of its gross domestic product on defense. That will remain. It spends 0.7% of its GDP on foreign aid. That will remain. Britain is globally committed. There were people in some sections of the Brexit camp who were very much pull up the drawbridge and sort of nostalgic little Englanders. That was not the case in the majority, and it certainly isn't the case in terms of the people who are pushing Brexit from the top. Brexit is not an isolationist ideology at all. And once Britain leaves the European Union, I think, as I say, I think you'll be very surprised, after all the bluster, all the concern, that actually Britain remains a responsible, engaged power in the world, a mid-level power, no delusions of grandeur, but perhaps punching a bit above its weight, as countries should do if they want to affect good results in the world. And I suspect that when we have this conversation this time next year, we'll have already seen the first signs of that, and when we have the conversation 2 years later, you'll all sit back and say, why was there such a fuss? Now, there might be a great big fuss when it comes to the future of the European Union and the potential domino effect. That's a very important subject in its own right, but I'll stop there because you asked me to give the British perspective about what's going on and what's likely to happen with the UK.
I can't tell you how relieved I am to hear a relatively optimistic projection of life after Brexit. And that's a good thing. You know, the American perspective is complicated by the fact that there's some around President Trump and perhaps President Trump himself who are deeply skeptical and sometimes worse with respect to the European Union, forgetting that America thought it was a great idea in the first place. The whole point was to help unite the West so we didn't rip each other apart with more wars. I hope you're right that a year from now we will all be able to breathe a sigh of relief. I hope that turns out to be the case, but I want to hear whether the founding EU members, you know, either the French, our French or German friends, wants to jump in at this point.
Robin, I hear you. I hope you're right. I'm afraid you're not. Maybe Brexit isn't isolationist, but it is delusional. And it is delusional because it is a strategy to self-weaken Britain, and I am concerned about British weakness more than anything else. And that weakness might lead, that is my concern, into an unprincipled trade policy starting with China. It will lead into a divergent foreign policy interest born out of the consequences of Brexit. I would love to be wrong on this. I would love for you to be right on this, that we're all going to feel great about it, that Britain's going to feel great about it. And I just feel it is too simple to say we're just going to be good friends and carry on. I am concerned about a growing divergence of a foreign policy interest, whether you're inside the camp or whether you're outside the camp, has consequences.
Yes, thank you, Dan. Yes, I will say that I'm very concerned too, because if we consider the votes at the EU Council, the UK is certainly the most fervent supporter of a hard line towards Russia's aggressions to Ukraine, Georgia, and the war crimes committed in Syria. And for this only and very reason, I am really concerned about the possible departure of the UK. We all know that certainly the UK, and as you rightly pointed out, will still be part of a kind of military alliance with the EU, not talking only about NATO, of course. Certainly. But it's not exactly the same story if we don't have the UK on board. And if we consider the growing divergences within Europe on foreign policy, as you'd say it, but also on the main subjects related to security, I think it's a real source of concern. Who will advocate for Ukraine? Who will advocate for Georgia? Who will advocate for better junctions between EU security and defense policy and NATO? Who will be the main partner also of my own country, France? We know, of course, that the UK not only is a nuclear power, but also another permanent member of the UN Security Council. And it's quite important to have this strong relationship. Of course, we have the Saint-Malo agreement between the UK and France and other treaties. But it's not exactly the same story. And it's not the same story because on the military side, we share a lot when it comes to, I would say, the military mindsets, the capacity of interventions abroad. We are the only two European countries, the UK and France, to be part of external operations, for instance, abroad, could be in the Middle East, could be in Africa, could be in Afghanistan. We have some soldiers, but we don't have in the EU, unfortunately, the same habit of taking action. So for me, it's a big concern. Thank you.
I am, to confess, deeply pro-EU. I think they're a force for good in the world. And I think that dealing with the EU institutions, like the Commission, is actually not all that hard. It's no harder, in fact, it's probably easier than dealing with the US government. So I've always hated Brexit. But Nicolas, I'm tempted to ask you if you're worried about the loss of British leadership on issues like Russia, where Britain has played a strong, laudable role, helping strengthen the EU consensus to push back against Russian aggression. Now, I'm tempted to ask, why doesn't France pick up that torch? So that Germany, which also has played a leadership role, and I want to give Chancellor Merkel a lot of credit for her resistance to Putin's aggression. So Germany as a partner, but I want to give Michał Baranowski from Poland the floor because Poland joined the EU having learned on its own skin the consequences of a divided Europe, and was a champion of European Union resistance to Russian aggression, along with the UK, Sweden, the Dutch, after the shoot down of the Malaysian plane. But Michał, I'd love to hear your take about Brexit, and then to put you on the spot, do you share Robin's relative optimism, Thomas's deep pessimism, and Nicolas' worry about the future? Where do you fit on the spectrum?
Wonderful to be back in Tbilisi and talk with old friends and new friends. And I mean, Robin said that UK will be okay. I have a number of reasons where I am worried why the EU will be very different and weaker. I mean, it's wonderful to hear from Nicolas the points you made that I would love for you to you know, you are in a tough position of given what's going on right now in France, because we are, in fact, I would say, already are seeing the effects of Brexit before it happened with the French initiative of resetting relations with, or beginning to calling for reset relations with Russia. We have a missing in action Germany. We have a weakened Poland for reasons of domestic politics that makes it less of an active European player. And we, all of a sudden, in this country, we can see the news coming up this morning of a major European country calling for a new chapter in relations with Russia. And I think we will clearly see more of this. So that's on the political side. On the security side, after Brexit, 80% of NATO's defense spending will be coming outside of the continental Europe. So it will be US, UK, Turkey. 20% only will come from continental Europe. That's very worrying indeed. It will also change the power dynamics within Europe. Poland is a country that would love, across the political spectrum, would love to see Europe remain united in its architecture. After UK leaves, Eurozone will really become it. Poland will be the biggest non-Eurozone country without willingness in any foreseeable future to join. So there is a greater risk of multiple speed scenario in Europe. And then lastly, of course, EU's global role. Even though we clearly recognize the need to increase EU's global role with the rise of China and global competition, this is going to be again further diminished. So I think, I mean, there are some in Poland who say, look, maybe in a few years this is all going to be great, and UK will prove that this is the way to function. Those, you know, people that for whom sovereignty is a key concept, but for the most part, I count myself among those. We are very worried about losing a good friend of Europe, the kind of Europe we would like to see going forward.
Robin, try to bolster the optimistic case in the light of your fellow UK's still fellow EU members' skepticism. And in particular, I'm mindful of the message to our Georgian friends. If I were a Georgian, my first thought would be, for God's sakes, people, what is your problem? I would love to have your problems for 5 minutes. Okay.
I mean, it's true, and it's a little bit like that when you can tell people, you know, you're a steel worker in the north of England and say, you know, what are you complaining about? I mean, you know, if you're a steel worker in Bangladesh, you'd be really delighted with your 5% pay cut this year. You'd still be way better. That's not how people live their lives. They don't live their lives relative to someone else. They live it in terms of their own expectations and hopes and ambitions in life. In answer to the points that have been raised by my colleagues on this panel, I think that an awful lot of this is going to depend on the extent to which you view this through the prism of the EU's institutions and the extent to which you view it through the prism of the nation states of Europe and future cooperation. And I think what I was initially talking about was essentially, as a nation state, Britain is not going away. This is not an isolationist project. It is a global project, in fact. And there may be, in fact, Thomas raises something I was saying earlier, that one of my concerns, my biggest concern about Brexit, is that a country which is very heavily dominated by finance and finance capitalism in the City of London may start to drop its guard in order to scoop up a lot of the world's dirty money. There is about 20% of global GDP is dirty money, and it's always looking for a home. The British legal system has adopted various measures to try and combat money laundering, that kind of thing. There is a danger, and that would be the first thing I would be looking to hold Britain to account on, is that we don't drop our guard, because that is a great temptation. When it comes to the question of the institutions, look, there's no doubt about it that the EU as an institution is weaker after Britain leaves, clearly. One of the world's biggest economies, one of the world's biggest militaries, one of the world's most active diplomatic powers is going away. You can't be anything other than weaker after that happens. And there's an even more worrying spectre out there, which then actually brings the question back to people actually thinking about why Britain left and maybe the EU needs to reform itself in a very significant way. And that is the domino effect. All Britain needs to do, and I had this conversation with a number of EU ambassadors in Washington last year and the year before, and we kind of came to the agreement that all Britain needs to do 5 years after Brexit is to be posting economic growth rates in about the middle of the pack. And that's it, essentially. The fear, a lot of the campaign, as people may remember, to keep Britain in the European Union, it was called Project Fear. It was basically a scattergun effect of, you know, this will happen, that will happen. You know, there's no way the British economy can survive in any meaningful way outside the European Union. The moment that is disproved, then it becomes very difficult to hold the line potentially for a lot of movements inside the European Union, which might be pushing for the same kind of departure as Britain. That's the real threat. That's the real threat. The question of whether we cooperate or not cooperate, I think, is essentially a moot point, because first of all, Britain is leaving the EU. So it may well be the case that the British strong position on Russia is not there, and as you said, Dan, well, come on, France, you step up. Fine, that's a moot point now. You're going to have to just deal with that. The really big question is the existential one, which is if Britain succeeds and prospers 4, 5, 10 years from now, then where is the fear to hold people in?
I think Britain has successfully deterred all existing exits that we have, and the argument that you're making, not only is it unlikely to come true, but also it's very hard. It's going to be very hard to prove because it's all going to be counterfactuals. But my main argument is towards the danger of a multi-speed Europe. Multi-speed Europe is already there. With Brexit, multi-speed Europe will deepen. The Eurozone has a set of problems that it has attempted to solve, that it will need to continue to solve, which will gear towards more integration. So the core Europe will become, and already is, the Eurozone. Countries that are not in the Eurozone, Poland is the biggest of those, have signed a treaty obligating them, not giving them the choice, but obligating them to join the Eurozone. Poland does not have an interest in doing so. At the same time, it wants to have all the same rights and wants others not to deepen. Poland cannot have the cake and eat it. That will be a change that will be necessary, but it will also have some opportunities in it. Once Britain exits, there will be a treaty with governing the relationship between Britain and the remaining EU. I would say this is going to have opportunities in it for other countries to look at, whether there's ways to regulate their relationship with Europe, pieces that they can pick up, and I'm looking at Georgia as one example of those. So I think we're going to have a multi-speed and multi-architecture Europe, and Brexit is the starting point of that.
To tease that out, Thomas, you are suggesting that there is an upside to this rather large downside, which is a loosening of the architectural arrangements which may provide Georgia and Ukraine with opportunities.
Yes, that's what I'm suggesting. First of all, it's already the case. It's already the case in the Schengen zone. It's already the case with the Eurozone. So there is a flexible architecture there already. Britain will add an extra layer because it doesn't want to go the Swiss route. It doesn't want to go the Norwegian route. So therefore, it will open sort of a new chapter in this. So I would, if I was Georgia, I would want to look at a Western European country's relationship that, as you've pointed out, will want to be a close relationship. What I can learn and what I can tag on in my way towards integrating. What is a Brexit scenario, an an exit scenario could also be translated into an entry or a closer relationship scenario. That is very hard to say at this point because that agreement doesn't yet exist. But if and when it exists, I would be encouraging people to look at it closely.
Can I just jump in very quickly, because let's remember we are in Georgia. Interestingly enough, and again if we're looking for upsides out of what you see very much as a downside, the notion of cooperative arrangements in and around the continent of Europe that can have concentric circles, it's precisely a looser circle somewhere out there that will allow countries like Georgia in fact. And also countries like Turkey. Turkey has zero chance of getting into the European Union as currently constituted. 0.0. It's not going to happen. In a different kind of, there's a phrase that Europeans love saying, variable geometry, but let's say variable or wider and wider concentric circles where there's still some kind of meaningful European element to it, at some point on those circles, which are still meaningful, there is a place for countries like Georgia to get in. It's extremely difficult. If we're honest, we want to be nice to our host, but to be honest, it's extremely difficult to see Georgia getting into the European Union in a relatively short 5 to 10 year time horizon. But something like that, at a wider concentric circle, that is potentially something we can start thinking about.
So, Thomas, you've now contributed to Robin's attempt to paint a relatively optimistic future of the post-Brexit world as something less than a catastrophe. I wonder whether you're right, and leaping over the various, I think there are a number of swamps, sand traps, hazards, landmines along the way. But you know, I appreciate the optimism because I find despair just boring. But Nicola, do you share our colleagues' attempts to paint a better, a reasonable post-Brexit future with all kinds of, with Brexit opening up opportunities?
I think one of the main questions that we have right now is probably the question of the very raison d'être of Europe. What's Europe for? Basically, when Europe has been founded, it was mostly about, economic development, economic unions. Then after the enlargements, it was just to give the authorizations, but also to recognize the legitimacy of former dictatorships, either southern dictatorships like Spain, Portugal, Greece, but also former Soviet countries or in the Soviet areas country to join the club. But in fact, no one was really talking at that time about what we could call geopolitical Europe. And I think nowadays the real meaning of Europe is basically geopolitical, because we are living in a very dangerous world. Yes, Europe has enemies. We are nowadays suffering a war waged by Russia, which is basically a war on all values. Russia is trying to dismantle the rule of law, the international law, to undermine the international organizations, including the EU, OSCE, the UN, and especially the UN Security Council. And I think that's the real purpose of Europe, is to create this zone which is both a zone of values, liberal values, and a zone of security. And I think that from my point of view, that's a real shame or pity that the UK could no longer be a member of the club. That's why I was saying that we need the UK on board. But what I am fearing with a multi-speed Europe, and with the different concentric circles, optional areas, a lot of opt-outs, etc., is to have the first class, second class, third class members of the club. Yes, yes, but that's the true questions, because when it comes to the commitment to the basic values and security requirement, when it comes to the compliance with the basic EU rules, including the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, the free media, and these kind of things, what would be the common plate? If we don't have at least a common plate, not talking about the breakfast, the appetizer, and the dessert, and the coffee, and etc., and the wines, but what will be the real nature, the very nature of the common plate that we will offer, and what will be also the advantages, the gains that Europe is able to provide to all the members of the club. So I think it's a true issue, because most of the people right now consider that there is a kind of enlargement fatigue. If you ask the public opinion in the EU, they consider that we cannot accept any other member club. And also, most of the EU leaders are not any longer the enlargement issue on their programs. That's not on the top of the agenda. But if we stop the enlargement, what will happen to Europe? And if we consider that we have to promote the enlargement, what will be the legitimacy that in their speeches the EU leader will provide to convince the opinions that the enlargement is more than ever needed? And I think that we have just to add one point, which is that the public opinion in most of the EU countries, with maybe the exception of Poland or of the Baltic states, are absolutely not aware of the fact that you have a war in Ukraine, 3 hours time, 2 hours flight from Paris, 2 hours flight from Berlin. They are not aware of the occupation of Georgia. And most of the leaders, and also French leaders, German leaders, are not talking bluntly, loud and clear, about the Russian threats. So most of the European citizens consider that there is a kind of innocence. And how to mobilize the opinion on this kind of issues when those opinions are not really aware of this kind of threat? Maybe they consider China as a threat, economic threat from China. But from Russia, certainly not. They know nothing about Russia. So I think that's one of my points, because that's really the question of the advocacy in the 10 or 15 years to come. And I think that the very basis of the advocacy is really lacking nowadays.
Michał, Poland has been one of the chief beneficiaries of European Union membership, both in a material sense and a kind of civilizational sense, because Poland was fighting to be part of an undivided Europe. How do you see Brexit affecting that dynamic? I understand that the current Polish government has some skepticism about a strong federal Europe. On the other hand, the EU is massively popular in Poland, including among the electorate of the current Polish government, because they benefit from EU support. So, do you see the Polish government working with France and Germany to try to strengthen the EU, or taking advantage of Brexit to try to loosen it and create this variable geometry? And how do you, which is a technical way of asking the question, what's the future of a united Europe post-Brexit, which has done so much good? And in a context where, as Nicola pointed out, Russia's trying to tear it down. They want chaos. They want a return to nationalist Europe with everybody looking over their shoulder nervously at their neighbors. How do you see Poland's role in all of this?
I actually do think that Poland is one of the key pivots, key places where the future of Europe will play out in that sense. As you said, EU and Europe remains tremendously popular in Poland. I mean, we are all as Poles proud that 80% of people support Europe and the EU, and they, in their gut, they understand why it is important. And it is important, of course, because we get some EU money, but in the end, it's about peace in Europe. It's the civilizational case that you mentioned, is the ability to work and travel, and being part of the greater community that we were excluded from for all the decades since World War II. So the popularity remains there. The real debate is about the future and the level of federalism that we will see in the Europe coming forward. And we are in fact facing, this is very much a question that divides the current government and the opposition, that will be battled out in the next 3 weeks on October 13 in parliamentary election. Poland's place in the EU is one of the key issues dividing the two political camps, even though that's not necessarily fought out in the election. In the short term, either of whoever comes out from the election as a winner would actually like to do what Thomas described. I mean, because of the lack of support for joining the Eurozone, because of the problems that Eurozone has, because of the lack of reforms that we are still seeing, Poland would rather eat the cake and have it too, so actually be able to be part of the discussions that Eurozone is conducting, but without joining the club. The key question for Poland and others will be the level of pooling of sovereignty that the Polish people are willing to accept. If we do have, if the government wins the election, they have a different view of how the EU should operate. The real question is, can you find other allies with Britain, if Britain is out indeed, for a vision of Europe that is more of a loose ties rather than and based on national parliaments than around Brussels.
So I'm going to summarize this discussion and then open it up to the audience. And to summarize in this way, Brexit will happen, according to the Brit here. There are downside risks, both short-term and long-term, rather serious ones. There may be some potential second-order upsides for Georgia. I will add my prerogative as moderator. I hate Brexit because I think the United States needs another great democratic ally in the world to deal with the authoritarian dangers that we face. And because as an American, the alternative to a strong European Union is European wars. Like, you know, I know that's exaggerating it, but I present to you the first half of the 20th century, which is the motive force for the European Union. But it doesn't matter what I think. I mean,
I'm so sorry you're not in the government anymore.
But it does matter what the US does.
well, right. Happily, the next panel talks about the United States. I'm just giving my own views, but it is, I want to throw it open to the audience, both the Americans, Europeans, and Georgians here, to put the questions to the panel. So, in the 8 or 10 minutes we have remaining until someone yanks the stage away. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for a very wonderful session. I'm Gocha Goguadze, professor of Tbilisi State University, and around me are maybe 70,000 students in Tbilisi State University, in Batumi State University, and they always ask me, George, European civilization was born in Georgia. And nowadays we young Georgians see that in European Union are a lot of problems, and they sometimes forgot about our Asian countries. They forgot that Georgia really needs their support. So my question is for all speakers, all panelists. How you concretely think that small country, Georgia, with huge political and economical problems should wait from European Union, from our European partners? Thank you so much.
Does anyone want to take that? The question of, what is Europe's message to Georgia? Which is how I would summarize the question. Okay. Well, we'll take this question and go on. Randy.
Thanks, Dan. Randy Schoeneman, Halifax International Security Forum. It was Whither, Europe, I think, was the title of this panel. So I've got a non-Brexit question, particularly for Mikhail and Thomas. And it's two quotations at different times from Radek Sikorski. The first, I believe, when he was defense minister at the Munich Security Conference, he characterized Nord Stream as a new Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. And the second, some years later, when he was foreign minister, said he did not fear a strong Germany, he feared a weak Germany. I wonder what the panelists' comments are on those two thoughts and what it means for Whither, Europe.
Radek, always colorful. I'll take a third question. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for all panelists for so interesting presentations. My name is Nika Chitadze. I am professor of the International Brex University, Tbilisi, Georgia. My question is related to how the Russian Federation takes some advantage from the Brexit process. For example, in case of Georgia, yes, and by the agency of some pro-Russian forces, it spread some disinformation. Why, for example, Georgia needs to cooperate with the European Union when European Union, by this way, is disintegrating, yes, on the case of UK. Everybody knows that there is no threat of the withdrawal of the leaving of any other countries, yes, because UK itself was not so integrated because it was not neither the member of the Schengen zone and neither the member of the European monetary zone. Accordingly, by this way, with regard to the other countries, most of the 20 countries that are members of the European monetary zone, they are, of course, are not going to leave at the European Union. So, accordingly, what I want to say is that what should be done by this way somehow to fight with disinformation from the Russian side related to some spreading about the threat of the disintegration of the European Union. Thank you.
Okay, one more, ma'am.
Thank you. My question is related to hypothetical enumeration of the policies where UK will be aligning with European Union after Brexit. It's obvious that that will be common foreign security policy, common security defense policy, as well as perhaps sanctions policy. What else? Thank you. Nina Bieshuli from Tbilisi State University.
Okay, we can take one more question and then we'll have to do a lightning round. One more, and then lightning answers.
Thank you. Robin, we've known each other for a long time, and I think you and I agree on a lot of things, on Russia, on Georgia. on Jeremy Corbyn, I'm sure. So I think you and I have a lot in common. But cards on the table, I am a passionate Remainer. And I think that you presented the other case extremely well. I think it was extremely articulate, and the vast majority of people in the Leave campaign are not nearly as articulate as you are. I think it was really, really well done. All I know is that the vast majority of economists, including the IMF and the World Bank, think Britain will be worse off after Brexit. So that's ultimately what I'm basing it on. I have other beliefs as well. I think it'll be better for security. I think it'll help with a stronger position on Russia. But what I don't understand, so I think you put the argument beautifully, but from the economic point of view, I just don't see it.
Okay, so we've got 5 questions and not much time. It was, what is Europe's message to Georgia? It was Randy Schuneman's 2-part question about Germany, Nord Stream 2, and Radek Sikorski's famous challenge. Russia's ability to take advantage of Brexit, UK alignment with the European Union post-Brexit, and a challenge to you, Robin, because you leapt over a lot of darker scenarios, assuming that things will be fine in 5 years, which is not necessarily the case. Okay, so let's go down and let's try to answer them all before David Kramer yanks our microphones away.
Okay, yeah, I'll start with James, and thank you for that point as 2 Brits on different sides of the argument but can remain civil, which, as James will know, in the UK in the last few years has been one of the real problems. And it isn't just in the UK that civility in public life has been something that, you know, a bewildered and dismayed public has looked on. And this is a serious point. The fact that we can disagree about something but do so in a civil manner, and equally on this panel, is fundamental to regaining, one of the things for regaining the public trust. The question about, for one thing, I could easily just say, look, it's a moot point because it's going to happen and we'll see. It's speculative, we don't know. The economists, most of the same people who are predicting that Britain will be worse off after the EU were the same ones who said there would be a recession just after the vote because of the vote. They've got all these predictions wrong. There's no reason to believe they'll be right in the future. But we'll see. I mean, neither of us have a crystal ball. We'll see what happens. When it comes to the common foreign and security policy after Brexit, how Britain will cooperate, look, I mean, you know, the European Union's foreign policy when it comes to the big issues, and Georgia counts among one of the big issues, because it's an important country in its own right, but also, to be frank, because it's all part of the whole question of how we deal with Russia, has only ever successfully really been done at an intergovernmental level anyway. And this is why I say I think you'll be surprised how little changes when it comes to the really big issues that matter. If it comes down to accession, obviously Britain isn't going to be part of that because we won't have a say in it because we won't be a member of the European Union. But when it comes to dealing with Russia, Britain is not going to be any less engaged and any less able to be engaged than it is today. And as I say, some of this is speculative, we just have to wait and see. But I would not remain mired in pessimism, and I think Dan has correctly picked up that I'm putting an optimistic view, but it's not something that I'm saying just to make people feel good. I think there are very good reasons to believe that Britain is going to remain engaged in the world. And primarily among them is that the people who are driving Brexit from the top are not isolationists. There are some isolationists in that camp, but the people who are driving Brexit from the top are globalists who also see Russia as a major threat. The Trump, Obama, what would I say, Russia, what Russia thinks of Brexit. I was just actually, well, the reason why I said Trump and Obama is because, well, Russia might be happy about Brexit. Russia apparently was delighted, if not actually put Trump in the White House, if you believe some people. Russia is delighted about Barack Obama. We can't make our policy on the basis of whether Russia likes something or doesn't like something. Russia's analysis, if they're talking about potential disintegration, there is a risk out there. I think it's greater than Thomas says, that if Britain 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years after Brexit is doing very well economically, then the very fact, just that fact, even though we can't know how well Britain would have done anyway, whether it stayed in, it removes the catastrophe scenarios which have been attached to the risks associated with Brexit. There is a real risk of a domino effect in the next 5 to 10 years if Britain is doing well. Now, there were a couple of other questions, but I'll let other members of the panel deal with them.
Nicola, do you want to take on the happy assumptions of Robin, about Brexit?
Probably not.
Okay.
Sorry for that. Sorry for that. But I think I have just to answer very quickly to at least two questions. First of all, when it comes to SDP, it's fine, European defense and security policy. But the real problem is, well, it's nice to have good stances, to have common position. But what comes next? And there is a true frustration among our allies. I mean, Ukraine, Georgia, and of course, never forget the Syrian people. Because of our lack of willingness to take actions. We must not say that we are powerless. On the contrary, both the US and the EU are powerful. But we don't have the willingness to act. And I think that's the true issue that will affect the next coming days, coming weeks, coming months, coming years. And if we are not able to address this issue, then I think we will lose. The second thing about disinformation, very quickly. We quite often talk about, hard disinformation, about hacking, about, the Russians' narratives about, the Nazis in Kiev and this kind of moronness. But I think what is more invasive, more dangerous, is two things. Is the soft disinformations. Because we have some European leaders pasting Russian propaganda narratives about humiliations of Russia. Russia has been never humiliated. Passing propaganda about, the bad behaviors of NATO and the EU. We never behave badly. About many other things. And I think it's very important to understand that when we are just trying to appease Russia, then comes always this kind of narrative, not coming from the far right, not coming from the radical left, not coming from people like Le Pen, Salvini or Farage, but for the mainstream politicians. And it's even more dangerous, and I think we have to pay attention to that. And certainly we must have not only a EU response, but we must have a common transatlantic response to those threats. Thank you.
Thomas, you've got the Randy Schuneman's channeling of Radek Sikorski.
Yes, I take on the German, and if you allow me, I take on the Georgia thing as well, if you allow. On the Georgia thing, I think we should not mistake Western institutions for the West. Some people in my country argue, because that our title is Whither Europe. It's not going to happen, at least not in my book, if we understand the West to be a values-based club rather than an institution-based club. We're not simply based on the Atlantic Charter and the Washington Treaty, and we're not simply based on any number of EU treaties. This is the West that is generated by the transatlantic revolutions of 1776 and 1780 lines. So we may change some institutions, we may adjust them, that may have a period of confusion and turmoil as of now, and you may ask the question, what is the message to Georgia? Yes, I get that, I understand that. But it doesn't mean that the West will disappear. It will change its clothes, it will change its institutions, but it won't change its general outlook on the basic questions that I think Georgia cares about most. That would be my first point. The second is on the German thing. I get a chance to get Nord Stream. Isn't that great, right? So I simply cannot give you a good rationale for Nord Stream. I think it's a strategic blunder. I can explain an element of it. You cannot leave nuclear power. You cannot leave. You cannot get out of coal at the same time you get out of Russian gas, right? So you're going to have an increased need for Russian energy. The economics and the environment people tell us it's a great thing to do. Virtually all foreign policy people think it's a strategic blunder. Why do I think it is committed? I think Merkel can hold the line on Russia sanctions, but in her domestic portfolio, she cannot support this with this coalition partner. She one thing but not both. Kill Nord Stream and uphold sanctions. She's balancing something. My first point. My second point, I'm an opponent of Nord Stream 2. If the United States levies sanctions on Germany because of Nord Stream 2, that to me is an abuse of of secondary sanctions. That will make my argument mute, and I will find the violation of German sovereignty a graver infringement than Nord Stream 2. Be careful of what you do and how you influence the debate in my country. Third point, Nord Stream is not a project that can be that you can prevent. It's happening and it's going to be finished soon. So the question to me becomes, how do you actually, what do you do after Nord Stream? How do you address some of the concerns that our Eastern European allies rightly have in a post-Nord Stream world? And for that, I think Germany's going to have to pay a price. The second part of the question, strong, weak. Got it? Faster?
Yes.
Much faster. Okay. Then I'll say we are coming out of a successful domestic cycle, 13 years of Angela Merkel. We have no term limits. It's going to be, and there is something the Germans call Reformstau, a lack of reform. It's going to take a long time to clean up the late period of Angela Merkel. But Germany has done that before. It's going to take a while. Germany is a slow-moving machine, but it's a machine. It's moving, and it will be able to reform.
Okay, Michał, a brief but last word. You get to wrap us up.
I agree on a lot with Thomas about the Nord Stream 2, including that it's totally unnecessary project. One thing that is very clear, Randy, though, where I disagree, that it will remain a huge thorn in Polish-German relations if we can't do anything about it. Today, the European Commission has ruled against Opal, so part of Nord Stream 1. So I'm not sure if all hopes are lost on Nord Stream 2. And this is an issue that unites the very divided Polish political scene. Polish-German relations are crucial for the future of Europe. They are extremely complicated. We would need much more time. But if we are talking about EU that remains inclusive rather than this hardcore and multiple geometry of other countries that are not in Eurozone, if we are talking about Europe that has good relations with the US, that we figure out transatlantic relations, if you're talking about Europe that has common view on Russia and Eastern neighborhood, you need Poland and Germany to agree. Yes, we need the French in this as well, and the Italians, but actually a lot of the debates are within those this Berlin-Warsaw axis. So I hope we can figure it out.
All right, David, forgive us for running over, and thank you very much. I hope that this works out well. I have my doubts.